I think here in Acts chapter 5, I'm just going to talk about this first part of the story just because it's such a strange and mysterious story, and it's one of those in the Bible that we all come back to a little bit about Ananias and Sapphira. And so we learned in Acts chapter 4 that there was a whole group of people, believers in Jesus, who are together, and whenever someone's needy, people willingly will go and sell something they have and bring the money to the apostles, and then that'll be distributed to everyone who has need. My son was asking me recently, as we were talking about this idea of kind of sharing everything in common and what the disciples did, and talked about some groups of Christians who are doing that right now. And my son said, "Do you mean like communism?" And I had to describe to him, well, no, I think the difference is that communism, as we've seen it practiced for the most part, has been by force. It has been against people's will. It hasn't been by choice. And, we see this period of history in the church, and I think that through the lens of American culture, we get a little nervous, right? Because here these people are, and they're sharing all their possessions, and what's more, Ananias and Sapphira are struck dead by the Lord. It feels very dark and weird and maybe scary for us. But I think we have to remember what we saw in Acts chapter 4, which is that people were doing this willingly. And it was just out of their own joy that they gave what they had to help each other. And it was because of the way they were all agreeing to live together. And so specifically what happens, it says, "Now a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, also sold a piece of property. And with his wife's full knowledge, he kept back part of the money for himself and brought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet." And it's interesting, it doesn't say that he specifically says, here's all of it, but he lets them believe that this is all of it, right? And I think that we do that sometimes where we're well, I didn't lie. I just sort of let them assume that this other thing was true when I knew it wasn't. But Peter immediately, through the Holy Spirit, says, whoa, you kept this money. You held some back. And that isn't something he could have known. And I like what he says specifically in verse 4 because it points to the fact that all of this was voluntary and none of it was required. He says, didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied to men, but to God. And so that's what's fascinating is he's saying the land was yours. We didn't say it belonged to us. It was yours. And you sold it. You could have done anything you wanted with the money. I wonder had he come and said, hey, I sold my land. Here's half of it for the church. If that would have been fine. I think the problem came in that he felt some duty or some obligation to do what he saw other people doing, but he didn't himself feel that same calling to do what they were doing, but he wanted to look like he was doing what everyone else was doing. And I think that maybe that's where the problem comes in here. And then of course they bring his wife in and they say, oh, tell me, is this the price you got for the land? And she goes, oh yeah, it is. And then she dies also. So they both die, but it says they specifically die for lying to the Holy Spirit. And I think where maybe this can apply to us both in our regular lives the most is that sometimes instead of doing what we feel the Holy Spirit calling us to do, we're quick to try to take on what we see the Holy Spirit calling other people to do it. And we don't do it because we heard from God and we feel compelled. We do it sort of out of this desire to look good and to fit in and to seem oh, we're the same as you. Oh, yeah, I'm just going to do what you're doing. But we know we're not doing it with our whole hearts. Or we know we don't even feel called to do it. And we're just doing it out of that idea to fit in and belong. And it seems like that's really dangerous because specifically here, what happened was that they lied to the Holy Spirit. And I think it just shows that we can't trick God, right? You can't pretend to have more faith than you really have. You can't act convinced of something that you're not really convinced of. God knows the difference. He knows the difference and he sees into your heart. So that's what I wanted to talk about, just the idea that was completely voluntary. And I think that in following the Holy Spirit, most of what we do is completely voluntary. So all the more reason to respond based on what the Holy Spirit leads us to in our freedom and not based on the fear of man and what we see other people doing, and then we respond out of obligation. That's a pretty big distinction, and we can spend most of our lives trying to figure out how to quit just doing what looks good so that we'll be praised by men, and how to start doing what we actually feel called to do, and maybe not do at all what we don't feel called to do. Had he never sold the field, I think he would have lived. Had he sold the field and been upfront that he only wanted to give a part, I think he would have lived. I think it was the idea that he was just trying to look good instead of doing what the Holy Spirit was leading these other people to do, doing it out of being led, and then specifically because he tried to trick God, which is not the brightest idea. Okay, I left all the rest of Acts chapter 5, so I'm expecting all of us to unpack it in the comments, because I didn't unpack it. I didn't talk about it at all. So anything you want to talk about in Acts chapter 5, let's do it in the comments below, and then let's read Acts chapter 6 in preparation for tomorrow.